Good morning. I think we'll get started. We've started at 9 o'clock, which is on time for a minister, which is almost worthy of a round of applause in itself. But I'm glad to see so many people here today to discuss what is perhaps the biggest social and economic challenge of our time. I will shortly hand over to Matthew Griffith from the campaign group PricedOut, and then the Minister for Planning, Nick Boles. But first I'd like to say a few words about policy exchange and our interest in housing and planning. Housing is now one of the top 10 political issues facing the country, a position it hasn't held for decades. It is both a huge social and economic crisis. In this sense, we can claim to be ahead of the curve. Our first series of reports on housing were issued in 2005 to 2007, when Nick Boles was director here at Policy Exchange. We returned to this issue in 2010 with our award-winning report, Making Housing Affordable, and have continued to publish on a variety of topics. And you can get any of our work free at our website. We've pushed for both more housing, but also better quality housing, and we think the two issues are tied together. We welcome the Coalition are increasingly focused on the fact that they need to increase housing numbers, and to mention no names, have placed rising stars in key positions. We've always argued that new housing must deliver benefits for local people, and I look forward to seeing what the Minister has to say later on. I do hope that Nick Boles can build on the work of his predecessor Greg Clark to obtain the changes that we need, and we will continue to push for reform and more housing and better quality housing in this country. I'll now hand over to Matthew Griffiths from PricedOut to say a few words before the Minister speaks. If you want to speak, it's your longer than I will.
Thanks very much to the Policy Exchange for inviting us, and also to Alex for all his hard work on raising the issue of housing over the years. PricedOut is a volunteer organisation for people who are concerned about the high cost of housing. We're a broad mix of people. We consist of people who are just concerned about the social and economic consequences of high housing costs. We have parents and grandparents who are worried about where their children are going to live. But it's fair to say that the majority of our members are young people in their 20s and 30s themselves who are under pressure because of high housing costs. So, for example, we have members who are sleeping on their workshop floor because rent is too expensive. We have members who are sleeping on their friends' sofas. We have a lot of members who are still living with their parents despite still being in their mid-30s. And we also have lots of new parents who are living in cramped accommodation and don't have access to green space or gardens, and also face very high rental costs. These are also people who have been working and paying taxes for over a decade now in most cases. They are otherwise independent and successful young professionals, but our housing system is unfortunately letting them down. This comes in large part from the failure of successive governments to deal with housing, and most fundamentally from a failure to increase the amount of housing supply to what is needed. And those houses that we do build are often poor quality, cramped, and not in places that people want to live. I mean, this is not something that's just a result of a bad year. It's been going on for decades and decades, and it's something we need to reverse. When I take my one-year-old daughter to our local nursery, as well as discussing sleep deprivation, the main issue that people talk about is the high cost of housing. People are worried about running out of space and worried about the quality of life that they're going to be able to offer to their families. It is surely not too great an imaginative leap to think of this current generation as inheriting a housing policy that has delivered not just too few homes and therefore forcing up the price of housing, but homes that are too many flats in city centres with not enough gardens. So I think that everyone should welcome the greater prioritisation of housing that the Coalition is giving. And I think it's why Nick's appearance on Newsnight was so refreshing to so many of our members, not just because we had a planning minister who said we needed to build more housing. I mean, this is not, after all, so very rare. But it's also to have a minister who's clearly intelligent enough to think through the problems and do so independently, and also, critically, is honest enough to address these problems, even if it means dealing with quite delicate issues that are embedded in the British psyche in quite a deep way. as well as being pleased to see Nick on Newsnight, I think we've also been a bit depressed at the reaction, particularly in some quarters, in some ways for exactly the opposite reasons, because there hasn't been an honesty about the issues, there hasn't been an intelligent debate all too often, and all too often people are knowingly misusing figures and scaremongering. And this lack of honesty comes at a cost for real lives and real people. So this is just a friendly challenge for journalists who cover planning. As you file your stories, one thing you could do is go to your office and track down a young intern who's undoubtedly probably working there and ask them how much they're paying in rent, whether they're still living with their parents, and whether they still expect, whether they expect to buy a house, and whether they could do that without their parents' help or not. And what this does for their sense of the future and their sense of what family they can raise. So I'm sure Nick will not solve a problem overnight that's been building for so long, but we can welcome his honesty in addressing it so clearly and intelligently. Thank you.
And now to start the show, Nick Boles MP.
Thank you both, Mats, and thank you everybody for being here so early. I seem to remember when I was running Policy Exchange, we never did anything before 10 o'clock in the morning, so things have sharpened up since I left under Neil, who sadly is departing to help the Chancellor get some even better policies on housing and planning. At the Conservative Party conference last October, David Cameron set a clear direction for Conservatives in government. He declared that the mission of the modern Conservative Party is to build an aspiration nation in which we get behind people who want to get on in life. It's what's always made our hearts beat faster, he said. It's not just an economic mission, but a moral one too. I listened to that speech as one of David Cameron's newest and most junior ministers. And though I found the Prime Minister's message inspiring, implicit in it was a challenge that keeps me awake at night. No aspiration is more deeply embedded in the British psyche than the desire to own your own home. But the prospect of doing so has been slipping ever further out of the reach of millions of hard-working people. And this is a result of our decades-long failure to build enough houses, and the root cause of that is our decades-long refusal to release enough land for development. Of course, there are other problems affecting the housing market in the short term, most of all the lack of finance for buyers and developers since the credit crunch. And these the government is already tackling. First Buy, which helps reduce the deposit for first-time buyers to just 5% of the price of their new home, will invest £460 million, matched by house builders, to help 27,000 people by 2014. New Buy enables other households to access 95% mortgages for new-build homes, and the Prime Minister announced on Monday that we will bring forward further measures to increase the availability of affordable mortgages. Meanwhile, my colleague Mark Prisk is deploying £570 million in the Great Britain Building Fund to get building going on sites that already have planning permission, and another £225 million fund that the Deputy Prime Minister announced to accelerate the delivery of housing on large sites like Cranbrook in Devon and Ebbsfleet in Kent. But in the long term, the original source of our housing crisis is the failure of past governments to provide enough land for development. As Planning Minister, it is my job to persuade local authorities to make more land available so that more homes can be built and the price of new homes comes down, and thereby reverse a trend that has been heading in the wrong direction for decades. Now can you understand why I sleep a little uneasily? We should not underestimate the extent of Labour's failure to build enough homes in their years in office. The 2011 census revealed that in the noughties, home ownership in England fell for the first time in 60 years from 68% to 63%. Why? Because houses became too expensive. The homelessness charity Shelter has shown that if the price of food had risen as fast as the price of housing in the last 30 years, a supermarket chicken would now cost £47, and a jar of instant coffee £20. In the 1990s, the average person, setting aside 5% of an average income each week, could save up for a deposit on a house after 8 years. Today, it would take the same person 47 years. Some say this trend is inevitable, given a growing population, rising incomes, and a finite supply of land. But in Germany, real house prices have remained constant since 2000. And in the Netherlands, which has shared the UK's rapid growth in population, real house prices rose by a little bit more than a fifth in the same decade. So why did they nearly double in the UK? The answer is simple. We built too few houses to keep up with the rapid increase in the number of households needing a place to live, especially the dizzying increase in the number of people living on their own. Now, there are several reasons for this growth in the number of households. Some we should celebrate, like the fact that people are living longer. Others we should regret, like the high rate of divorce, or the fact that Labour's support for unlimited immigration led to a net influx of 1.7 million people into England in a decade. But all of these changes have happened, and all of the people concerned have a right to a decent home. In 2008, Shelter estimated that we would need to build 240,000 new homes a year in England to cater for all of these new households. In February 2012, Alan Holmans from the Cambridge Centre for Housing and Planning Research updated these estimates using my department's publication of new projections of the number of households. He concluded that to keep pace with this trend, we now need to build 270,000 new homes a year, leading to a net increase in the number of homes of 250,000 a year, as 20,000 would replace existing homes that have to be demolished. Now, I don't know whether Mr. Holman's projections will prove accurate, but I do know that the house building that took place during the noughties fell woefully short of what was necessary. Despite a decade of easy credit and an explicit target to build 213,000 new homes a year in England, the last government only managed to complete an annual average of 147,000 new homes between 2000 and 2010. In the same period, the population went up by 3.4 million, and from 1998 to 2008, the number of households went up by 1.7 million. On average, in each year of the noughties, the Netherlands built over 4.4 new homes for every 1,000 inhabitants. The French built over 5.6 for every 1,000 inhabitants. In England, we built 2.9. And this is in spite of the fact that between 2000 and 2010, total mortgage debt in the UK more than doubled, from £500 billion to £1.24 trillion. Labour's debt binge just fueled a massive boom in prices and did very little to boost the supply of new homes. Those homes that were built got smaller and smaller as land prices went up and up. From 2001 to 2003, the new houses we built in England were smaller than the average houses that we've already got, and 30% smaller than the new houses being built in the Netherlands, a country that is more densely populated than our own. For housing, as in so many areas of our national life under Labour, the noughties were a wasted decade. Loads of money sloshing around, lots of top-down targets, but very little to show for it. So now we have to build even more houses to make up for the ground lost while they were in office and to keep pace with future growth in the number of households needing homes. And that all assumes that we continue to tighten our grip on immigration so that net migration falls below 100,000 a year by 2015. Now, I really do understand why the idea of a lot more house building makes people nervous. And I certainly don't want to see more open land developed than is necessary. But there is no painless way to make homes affordable for working people earning ordinary wages. What about all the empty homes, people ask? And they're certainly right to suggest that we should make full use of our existing housing stock. But most empty homes are only empty for short periods while they change hands or are renovated or are caught up in probate after the last owner's death. There are around 259,000 houses that have been empty for more than 6 months, 50,000 fewer than in 2009. And the government has already invested £160 million, and that, together with a share of the £300 million additional spending announced in September's housing growth package, should help put over 15,000 empty properties back into use by 2015. Nobody wants to see good homes standing empty, but they can't make more than a marginal contribution to the hundreds of thousands of new homes that we need every year. What about all the brownfield land, people then ask? And they point to the CPRE's estimate that England has enough brownfield land to support 1.5 million homes. Now, we all want to maximise the number of homes we build on previously developed land, not least because such land tends to benefit from existing links to our road and rail networks. But even the CPRE admitted that we would only get 450,000 new homes out of brownfield sites in those parts of the country where most of the new homes are needed: London, the South East, and the South West. And achieving that number would require us to build on every scrap of brownfield land. The fact is that we are already building most new homes on brownfield land. 76% of all of the homes completed in 2010, as against 56% in 1997. We simply can't squeeze much more out of brownfield sites. To restrict new house building to brownfield land would leave us a long way short of the number of new homes we need. So what about the developers' land banks, people then ask? And again, I understand why it riles people that their local councils have to find new sites for development when the major house builders are sitting on land with permission to build hundreds of thousands of new homes. But I'm afraid this concern is also misplaced, resting on a misunderstanding about how the British house building industry works. At the end of September 2012, on sites of 10 or more units, there were 487,000 units with detailed planning permission. About 246,000 of them were on sites where no building has taken place at all. And the Growth and Infrastructure Bill that I'm currently taking through Parliament with colleagues will make it easier for developers to renegotiate the unaffordable Section 106 agreements that have made many of these schemes unviable and therefore caused them to stall. Most sites with planning permission are for schemes of 150 units or more, which developers generally build out over 3 or 5 or even 10 years. So if we're going to have any prospect of getting our current house builders to build the number of new homes we need them to have a pipeline of sites representing 3 to 5 years' supply. That's over 1 million units. The problem with developers' land banks is not that they exist, but they are currently much too small to feed the level of house building that we need. So I'm afraid that we have a simple, if painful, choice. We can decide to ignore the misery of young families forced to grow up in tiny flats with no outside space. We can pass by on the other side while working men and women in their 20s and 30s have to live with their parents or share bedrooms with friends. We can turn a blind eye while Margaret Thatcher's dream of a property-owning democracy shrivels, and shrug our shoulders as home ownership reverts to what it was in the 19th century, a privilege, the exclusive preserve of people with large incomes or wealthy parents. But I don't believe that anyone really wants to go down that road, certainly not any Conservative. If we believe in anything, we believe in the power of home ownership to motivate people to work hard, raise strong families, and build healthy communities, to put down roots, to take responsibility for their surroundings, and to look out for their neighbours. As David Cameron said, we get behind people who want to get on in life, the young people who dream of their first paycheck, their first car, their first home, and are ready and willing to work hard to get those things. So there is only one choice for a Conservative: to accept that we are going to have to build on previously undeveloped land, and to resolve that we will make these decisions locally, and that we will build beautiful places like we used to. That way, England can remain the green and pleasant land that we all love. Now, we start from a good position, because contrary to media myth, we've got plenty of undistinguished, undeveloped land to spare. By overlaying satellite imagery onto Ordnance Survey maps, the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology's 2007 land cover map shows that 8.9% of England is built up or developed as gardens. That means that over 90% is not. Our national parks, sites of special scientific interest, areas of outstanding natural beauty, together account for around 30%, more than 3 times the amount that is built on. If we then include the green belts that stop our cities sprawling without limit, the total goes up to around 40%. 40% that is protected from development, more than 4 times the area that is built on. Then there are ancient woodlands and other irreplaceable habitats which are protected by the National Planning Policy Framework, and other important sites which lie outside the official designations but are rightly championed by organisations like the RSPB and the Woodland Trust. There is high-quality agricultural land which all of us want to see used for the essential purpose of growing food. And there are much-loved open spaces in villages and towns which local people understandably want to keep intact. Nothing I have said, and nothing that this government has done, will undermine the protection of national parks, SSSIs, AONBs, and the Green Belt, or stop at good agricultural land being used for farming, or prevent councils from identifying ancient woodland and green spaces that local people want them to protect. And nothing that I've said and nothing that this government has done involves telling communities how many new houses they should accept or where they should be built. Labour's housing targets caused enormous resentment and, as we've seen, failed to deliver the goods. By the end of their time in office, house building had fallen to its lowest peacetime level since the 1920s. So we have already revoked the regional strategy for the East of England, and having considered the responses to the consultation on the environmental report, I can announce today that I've decided to revoke the equivalent edict for Yorkshire and the Humber, while saving the policies to protect York's Green Belt. I will be making decisions about the other regional strategies in due course, once the consultations on other environmental reports have closed. But the localism that Eric Pickles has unleashed is not and has never been a one-way street. As he has always said, with power comes responsibility. And the National Planning Policy Framework spells it out very clearly. As they draw up their local plans, councils must assess their local housing need in an objective way, and they must identify immediately developable sites sufficient to supply all of the new homes that are needed over the next 5 years. Now, many councils are embracing this duty with energy and imagination, but some are dragging their feet, and a few are looking for ways to evade their responsibilities or slough them off onto their neighbours because the politics of house building is just too difficult. Well, that is not acceptable. Councils which do not produce credible plans to meet local housing need will find that the presumption in favour of sustainable development will trump local decisions. And they will have to explain to local residents why their failure to produce a robust local plan exposed their communities to speculative development in places where it is not welcome. I will not defend, and the government will not support those local councils who abdicate their responsibility to meet their fair share of our common housing needs. But I'm not going to pretend that it will be easy for them. Councillors will have to find a way to persuade the people who elect them that substantial further house building is in the interest of the whole community, including those who are living there now. And we are giving them the tools they need to go about this. The first thing that people want is input into the plans for development in their neighbourhood. And not just perfunctory consultation that is acknowledged but then ignored, but real involvement and a vote on the outcome. So that's why we've created the option of a neighbourhood plan, which is drawn up by representatives of a defined community and subject to a referendum of all of their neighbours before it can be adopted and form part of the statutory plan. 300 localities are already pursuing a neighbourhood plan, from Tame in South Oxfordshire to St James's Ward in central Exeter to central Milton Keynes. And the trailblazer is Upper Eden in Cumbria, where I was on Monday. Their neighbourhood plan will be the first to be put to the test in a local referendum in March of this year. The second thing people want, aside from that local input and control, is a share in the benefits that new development can bring, whether that takes the form of a boost in the local authority's tax revenues or an investment in new community facilities or better infrastructure. That's why we've introduced the new homes bonus that gives local councils over £8,000 over 6 years for every new council tax Band D home that gets built. Councils received £430 million in new homes bonus in 2012-13 and are provisionally set to receive £660 million in 2013-14. But we need incentives, as Policy Exchange has pointed out, that are even more local, so that the people who have to live with new housing developments get a direct benefit from them. So today, I'm pleased to be able to announce that in areas that charge the new community infrastructure levy, neighbourhoods which accept new development will get 15% of the revenues from the levy, up to a maximum of £100 per existing household. And because I believe, and the government believes, that neighbourhood plans are the key to unlocking more house building, those communities that draw up a neighbourhood plan and have it approved by local people in a referendum will receive 25% of these revenues with no upper limit. Now, there are very few places that have introduced the community infrastructure levy so far, but we've worked up a few examples in the department, and it means that a community can honestly expect £200,000, £300,000, maybe even £400,000 to flow to them to spend on their priorities if they draw up a neighbourhood plan that incorporates a reasonable level of new development. So, if you want to re-roof your village hall, build a permanent home for your community shop, as my stepmother does, refurbish the municipal swimming pool, implement a new landscape design in your local park, or save your local pub as the hub of your community, look no further. Jump on the bandwagon and get yourself a neighbourhood plan. This government believes in localism. We believe that if you give people power, they will use it responsibly. If you explain to them what their community and their country needs, they will do their bit to make sure it is provided. And if you give them a stake in a future in which beautifully designed homes with easy access to green space are once again affordable for working people on ordinary wages, they will do what it takes to bring that future about. From my perch on the lower branches at the Department for Communities and Local Government, I look around the great wood that is the British government, and I see other ministers battering away at the barriers that hold people back with gusto and grit. Ian Duncan Smith reforming the benefit system to ensure that work always pays. Michael Gove giving schools control over their destinies while ramping up expectations of the standards they will achieve for their students. They are an inspiration and a goad. An inspiration because they are ministers who have identified a shocking injustice in the way our society works and are fearless in their determination to spread the privilege of a good education and a decent job. And a goad because we are more than halfway through this Parliament, and it's now up to me to make sure that our reform planning system provides enough land to build the houses that England's next generation so desperately needs. When it does, I'm sure I'll have no problem sleeping at nights. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for a great and very interesting speech. And I'm sure I have lots of questions, but I'm not going to hog. So I'll throw it open to the floor and say, who has any questions they'd like to put to the Minister? The gentleman in the second row. If you could state your name and where you're from as well, please.
David Birkbeck, Design for Homes. I applaud nearly everything you said. I think it's fantastic. The one thing I wanted to ask, are you missing a trick? I'll give you an example. The northeast of England has the weakest economy in England. It has the fastest growth in its greenbelt. Since the mid-90s, it's grown by more than a quarter. Every area of the northeast of England where people want to live has effectively drawn up the drawbridge. I won't name the towns or the local councils, but essentially, if you are interested in buying a house in one of the key market towns in somewhere like Northumberland, the drawbridge was drawn up about 1997. The most explicit example of this is a place where they were building on average 60 homes a year between 70 and 97, and since then, they've never built more than 6 in any single year. So you can see how fast the decline is. In 1 year, there was actually a net drop in the number of homes in that location. By comparison, Cambridge has taken 280 hectares of land out of its greenbelt, and in return, it now has housing allocations and housing permissions for the largest number of homes of a town of that size anywhere in England. Not only that, it has the best homes, easily the best homes. I saw you at Harlow last night. You should have gone to Cambridge. There is a much better scheme in Cambridge. And you can see the kind of payoff. You bring that land, which is right on the doorstep, right where the employment is, right where the transport networks is, into the local plan, out of the greenbelt, you get fantastic quality house building.
So it's your main point that one of the things I think people don't realise is the greenbelt is in the north as well as around London, is your argument that we should be looking in places like that to expand, to get more housing built on the greenbelt in those areas.
I feel the greenbelt is probably the only place in Britain at the moment where the land isn't already camped on by speculators. You know, and that's possibly where you'll get quite a lot of housing built without the traditional expectations of very, very high land values before you even begin.
Dave, thank you, and you've been very helpful and helping me understanding, you know, how to make new developments beautiful again, like in Letchworth and Newhall and elsewhere. This is a difficult issue, but I think we just need to sort of clarify a few facts, and then I'll say what we believe is the right approach. I talked about national parks, SSSIs, sites of special scientific interest, areas of outstanding natural beauty, and the protections that attach to them. And of course, they are absolute. And in the sense, once you are an SSSI, or an AOMB, or a national park, that's it, you are forever. You could expand. I believe that the national park in the Lake District is about to expand a little, probably. But you can't, in a sense, adjust flexibly your boundaries. Now, the Greenbelt protection is as strong in the National Planning Policy Framework, in fact, slightly stronger than it was in any national policy. But it's never been the case that the Greenbelt is absolutely fixed in terms of where the boundaries are. Local authorities have always been able, as Cambridge has done, to adjust the boundaries to persuade local people, actually, let's put our housing there, or our retail park, or our industrial park, or business centre, and let's then perhaps add a bit of green belt elsewhere, or maybe invest in making the green belt properly green, because let's remember, lots of the green belt is just big fields full of rape, not actually the lovely open countryside that people think it sometimes is. So there's always been that flexibility. Now the question, in a sense, you're asking me is, shouldn't national government be stopping local authorities from sticking overly rigidly to their green belt boundaries, their existing green belt boundaries? And of course, in a sense, there's every minister, you have your brief moment where you think you have, you're at the controls and you long to pull a few levers. But I think that would be a profound mistake, because I think that if we try and beat people over the head, this is an ancient democracy. And the last decade demonstrated it. There were no shortage of edicts and targets and diktats and everything else. And it just didn't work. It simply didn't work. Whether you think it's, even if you're neutral about whether it's a right approach or a wrong approach morally, it just didn't deliver. And so I genuinely believe that all of us who have an itch to impose or intervene have to bite our tongues, pull ourselves back and say, no, we've got to persuade people. Now, that said, the NPPF is very clear. Those local authorities in the North East too, they have to assess their needs and build for to provide the sites for 5 years. And if they don't, then their local plan won't be robust, and their own protection of the green belt will not have the same strength as it would otherwise do. So actually, there is a dynamic in the NPPF which pushes local authorities to take responsible decisions. But I just don't believe that it's for ministers to tell local authorities how to discharge their responsibilities. What I'm going to do is carry on making arguments like this to make sure they certainly understand what those responsibilities are.
So the gentleman in the third row there.
Mark Flessing from Pocket. I'm going to take it for granted that the Minister would agree with the statement that the government will want to see the private sector pulling in its weight in the delivery of NPPF-compliant, well-designed intermediate housing in order to assist in the growth of provision for the squeezed middle. Does it therefore make sense that the definition of who is exempt from paying CIL is at odds with the NPPF's definition of affordable housing, such that an awful lot of well-designed NPPF-compliant affordable housing will now be caught by CIL and therefore will not occur? And would the Minister, apart from wanting to review that, which I'm sure he will do over the next couple of months, will he also want to look into the fact that there are now 3 proposed and completely at variance definitions of affordable housing between the current bill going through Parliament, the NPPF and the Housing Act?
They're very good questions. Can I first just say, if anybody calls me Minister again, I'm going to start looking around me like that. My name's Nick, by the way. Just to say, I'm well aware of the issue that you're pointing to. CIL, for those of you who aren't sort of nerdy planning types like me, is the Community Infrastructure Levy, where we've just been announcing the share that will go to neighbourhoods. We are doing a lot of work with both the developer community and the Local Government Association to iron out some teething troubles that have been identified in that. One of them is the exemptions to CIL and the precise definition of affordable housing. So while I can't say anything definite now, I absolutely understand the problem. We realise that it's something that we need to try and work out a way to deal with.
So there are 2 questions, and I'm going to move towards the back, but the gentleman with grey hair there and the gentleman with the red tie after him in the second row. And then the lady with the red hair after that. So we'll sort of do that bit and then move over there.
Richard Blythe, Royal Town Planning Institute. I'm very impressed that you are in favour of sorting out the housing problem. It's great. I'm very impressed to see that CLG is working on that. I'd quite like to raise a question of how many other government departments in the big tree, which I hope is not an ash tree. For example, decisions on major national transport infrastructure supervised by DFT, such as the possibility of expanded London airport capacity, current and future high-speed rail proposals. I don't see any evidence myself in the way those kind of proposals are being adjudged and appraised of the contribution they might potentially make to providing additional accessible housing land on a substantial scale? And is there any way in which your department could perhaps put pressure on other departments to pull behind you in what is a very creditable national priority?
Do you want to do three questions or one at a time? Okay, we'll do the three at once. So the lady with red hair and then the gentleman with the red tie.
Hi, Paula Higgins from Homeowners Alliance. Good to hear all the support and you've announced today. I'm just wondering if you could clarify what you're doing. You also said about increasing more housing, but the quality of the housing. So you do recognise that the quality of the new houses being built maybe not as up to scratch. So I'd like to hear a bit more about what the department's doing about that. Thank you.
And the gentleman with the red tie in the second row.
Thank you, Nick. Mike Leonard from the Modern Masonry Alliance. We're the manufacturers of bricks and blocks. We'd like you to be able to sleep at night, first of all. So our concern, obviously, you've talked a lot about the demand side from housing, which is quite evident. You haven't talked so much about the economic benefits of a big house building programme, a controlled one. And you also haven't talked about, and I accept the fact that this coalition government doesn't like targets, but any sort of driver that says, because we're looking down the barrel of less houses being built this year than last year and years gone by, really. And we're seeing manufacturing capacity being lost right now that we will need for the future to build all those houses that you've identified. So anything that can make it happen this year and any sort of numbers would say, look, this is aspiration, this is where we're trying to get to, would be really helpful.
Yeah. Good. Well, shall I just try and handle those three? Firstly, the Highways Agency and major road schemes. I mean, I think the best way of putting it is that increasingly over the last couple of months, I sort of find myself bumping into highways at one level or another. I've got a local case where there's an issue about how do you get consent for a new junction on a highway in my constituency. There are many places where the lack of a new road means that they can't get on and build some substantial amount of housing. I've had a very distinguished architect in my constituency who was in not last night's Newsnight programme, but in the film the first time, tell me that the reason why great architects don't go into the business of designing housing is because the highways requirements makes it impossible to do anything imaginative or interesting. Now, not everybody agrees with that, by the way, but I just feel like everybody is sort of prodding me and saying, if you don't talk to the Department for Transport about highways requirements, you're not going to actually unblock a lot of these problems. So it's one of my New Year's resolutions to seek a meeting with my opposite number in the Department for Transport and just to really try and understand their perspective. So you've added, as it were, an item on the agenda, because it's not one I'd thought of before. What are we doing to make sure that when we're putting in HS2 or when we're putting in major road schemes, that we're actually thinking from the beginning, because that's always the cheapest place to do it, about how that can be used to actually unblock some new settlements or other major schemes. So I will take it up, I promise. Quality of housing. Now, there's a very interesting debate in this. It's almost a philosophical debate, but it's also a practical one, which is, do you get quality up by writing very clear standards, having very strong, building regulations and all of that? Or do you get quality up by reducing the cost of other aspects of the building process, so that then actually builders and developers can respond to consumers? Because if you do go to Germany or the Netherlands, what you will find is that the quality of their new build, it's a wide variety, but nevertheless is just a lot better, and yet their houses are cheaper. Why? Because the land price is so much lower. There's just more room to breathe. And call me naive, but I don't believe, I got into a bit of hot water for calling a particular development pig ugly. I don't resile from that description, actually. But it's not that I believe that people are out there wanting to build pig ugly developments. It's just that they've got incredibly tight, no room to manoeuvre. The land price is so high. The planning process is expensive, too. There was a very interesting point. The leader of Kent came to see me, and he said that he's working quite closely with Bouygues, the big French house builder, and Skanska, and they both said the cost of building an affordable home in England is, and this is not the land cost, this is just the cost of the process, is 25% higher than in France because of all of the processes that we have to go through. So that's why we're doing a lot of the streamlining. So I'm sorry, that's a long answer of saying I think that focusing on land availability and the planning process, liberalising and freeing that up, will actually do more to help quality than any number of codes about, you know, how wide doors should be and what materials you should make your roof out of. Leading neatly on to materials to build with. I mean, I completely understand, and my constituency, I've got lots of small builders who are having a horrible time. They got a lot of work from the public sector building programs of the last 10, 15 years. House building is, you know, slowed dramatically during the credit crunch. We are trying to do everything we can to get credit into the system. Now, as I said in the speech, in the long term, you know, we need to fix the long-term problem. But in the short term, we're in the system we've got, and we've got to get the ship off the rocks. And that's why the Chancellor announced this £10 billion guarantee scheme for privately rented construction, £300 million more of subsidy for new affordable and other kinds of housing construction. I mean, we are trying to put money into the system anywhere we can. In the sort of medium to long term, I mean, if I had to sort of hope, it's that, you know, that everybody who currently builds houses goes on building roughly the number they currently build plus 10%. And that then we bring in to the industry a whole bunch of new people and a huge number of self-build. And self-build doesn't mean what I'd wondered it did, is this sort of Kevin McLeod, you know, you have to go every Sunday morning and, you know, lay foundations yourself. Self-build just means you buy a plot of land, you get planning permission, you hire a local builder, maybe a local architect, and you are your own developer. It should be called self-develop. And in Germany, again, I'm sorry to obsess about Germany, but a huge proportion of their building supply is done by that route. And the more of that we could get in, I think the more responsive a housing market we'd have, the higher quality we'd get, because the customer would be designing their own home. And then your client, your members, would actually have a much less unstable position because you're so reliant on a very, very small number of players.
On the quality issue, do you want to talk a bit about neighbourhood plans? I think in your speech that was one of your key issues, is you can use that to drive towards quality.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we need to be careful about it. What we don't really want people in neighbourhood plans thinking they can do is that they can sort of all turn themselves into, you know, informal building surveyors and planners. What they absolutely can do, though, is say, you know, what are the local design themes? You know, a design code for the locality about, you know, how it should look to be in keeping. But equally what we don't want them doing is sort of somehow saying you must have windows of exactly this shape and size and thickness. So it's about appearance rather than necessarily construction.
The gentleman at the front here, and then the gentleman at the back there.
Hi, Jason Gross from the Daily Mail. A couple of questions. Firstly, do you think that you've got the planning system now in the state that you need to deliver what you're talking about, or do you need further reform? And secondly, could I just ask you quickly about your pretty personal clash with Simon Jenkins on Newsnight last night? I mean, do you consider him and the National Trust to be sort of NIMBYs in all this? And to keep it personal, I mean, your father was a National Trust DG. Would he be on your side of the argument or Simon Jenkins?
Nice question. I'll deal with the sort of formal bit first, which is, do we have the planning policies in the shape that they need to be? The difficulty is, if you're basically a conservative / an economic liberal, is that what you believe is the only thing that produces change in systems is incentives and freedom. It then means that it's almost impossible to know quite how people are going to respond, how quickly they're going to respond, in what way they're going to respond. And we think we've made a huge progress. We've simplified the planning system dramatically. We've made the responsibilities clear in the NPPF. We've taken away the top-down targets. We've put in place the new homes bonus. We're now putting in place this SIL and the share for neighbourhoods. We created the option of neighbourhood plans. That's a huge move. But I'm not going to stand here and say that it will necessarily be enough. And equally, I want everybody to go away from here understanding if it isn't enough, we'll rely on Policy Exchange to do a bit more work, and we'll come back with some new ideas. But what we're not going to do is to reverse our approach. We're not going to go back to top-down targets. We're not going to go back to telling people, you know, what they should do with the land in their area. It's got to be done through incentives, through persuasion, and through a helpful nudge, and no more pressure than that from central government, because it just simply doesn't work. It's not just that I think it's wrong, it doesn't work. On the personal point, sorry, I mean, firstly, to be very, very clear, you know, the National Trust, I think, has made it the most amazing. For my money, bluntly, it's probably the best institution in Britain. You know, it's the most successful, it's the most popular, it's done stuff that almost everybody in the country thinks is entirely admirable. So I'm an absolutely passionate advocate of the National Trust. Simon and I have had our ding-dongs over the years. Now, I commissioned Simon to do work for Policy Exchange. We agree about many, many things. I do believe he's profoundly wrong on this issue. And I'm not going to sort of use my love for the National Trust or my long, acquaintance with Simon and friendly cooperation with him to stop me from saying when I think he's wrong. And that's what I was saying last night. As for my dad, he's entitled to his own opinions, and he's 87, so I think he's entitled to keep them to himself if he wants to.
Could I just ask, are there any people from the opposition, and then I'll go back to the gentleman there, because I'm quite interested in this point that you're not going to reverse. Is there anyone from the opposition here? Because I would like to, do they think they would reverse this direction? If they're not here, we'll have to move on, but it's something that, do you think will it reverse this direction? Or? I mean,
there is a very interesting question, which is that were there to be a Labour government after the next election or the one after that, would they reimpose regional strategies? Would they reimpose regional housing targets? I mean, I don't detect, they're certainly not saying so now, but then they're not saying a whole lot, frankly, now. So, but I don't detect that because I think that privately they probably didn't think that worked either. Whether they would necessarily endorse everything we're doing, of course, is a quite different point.
So the gentleman at the back there. Yes, sorry.
John Stewart from Home Builders Federation. Hello, Nick. First of all, I agree with David. I could have given your speech and agreed with everything in it. It's brilliant. The Policy Exchange is ahead of the curve, 2005. I prepared a report for HBF in 2002 called Building a Crisis. And it was a very lonely position back then. Yeah. Can I make a comment and ask you a question on the specific announcement you made today? The comment is this issue of quality. It's a really slippery concept because in terms of build quality, like building regs, you can legislate for that to an extent. You can have building regs, you can have the code of conduct that we have, you can have the warranty system, and I think they're all world-beating. I think what most people mean by quality in the context of the discussion we just had is the aesthetics, the look, and it's really difficult to legislate for that. It's a really very difficult area.
I agree.
Can I ask you specific on the announcement you made today? The community infrastructure levy is prepared by the district council, and it's funding to go towards the infrastructure that will be needed to support the development in the local plan. You could imagine a situation where there might be a conflict between that and what you're proposing today. Imagine a district is divided into two neighbourhood areas. One has most of the development in it, but the other one is where most of the infrastructure is needed. You can imagine situations where that would happen. If you take 25% and give it to the local community, and they don't have any particular infrastructure needs, they might spend it on things that are not especially important, like the village pub, whereas the infrastructure that's...
You're not in politics, are you?
I knew that would be provocative. Whereas, for example, road improvements, which might fall in the other neighbourhood area, might need a lot of money, and now they've got 25% less to spend on it. So you can see that you're trying to achieve two objectives. One is fund the infrastructure, but two is to keep the local people happy, and you could end up with a conflict there, I think.
I will come back to that just because there were two bits, so otherwise I'll forget them. Just on the first point, on the comment, I completely agree with you. I actually do, and slightly disagree with David, because I'm looking forward to going to Cambridge with him soon. The new hall development in Harlow, for my money, is one of the most inspiring and optimistic and exciting places. And, it didn't require a prince or a duke to do it. It isn't pastiche at all. There's a huge variety, some very modern housing in it. It was done because of a very, very far-thinking and frankly socially responsible landowner who actually thought about what they wanted. Apparently, my understanding is, and I'm looking forward to meeting them, I hope, at some point, but is that they initially gave it to one single big player, and they weren't very happy with what happened. And they took it back, and they then got quite a number of different developers to build different bits, but in part of a master plan. And there is, as a result, a huge variety in the houses, but yet it all hangs together, and it is all great. And you're absolutely right. It's done as a result of consumer demand, property owner responsibility, architects' imaginations. I mean, none of us are ever going to be happy with everything, but it's not something that you can legislate. Now, to reassure you, I hope a little bit on the neighbourhood share. Newsnight got a little bit excited about my unfortunate joke about bungs last night, which was perhaps slightly misleading. Firstly, communities will have to say what they're going to, neighbourhoods will have to say what they're going to be spending any share of the levy on. So they'll have to go through a process of thinking about it and publishing it. Everybody will know what that is. Secondly, that it will have to be something that is genuinely of community benefit. They can't go out and gold plate their postbox just sort of willy-nilly. But secondly, I think this is perhaps the most important point, is they're going to get a big chunk of money with a bit of luck. That doesn't absolve them of taking a responsible approach to the larger community of which they're a part. And frankly, if the larger community needs to make a big investment either in a road or in a new sewerage system or in a waste, one of those things that burns up waste, whatever it is, it's perfectly right and proper for the district council and the county council to come down and sit down to them and say, you've just got, £500,000 from this development. Could you make a contribution, please? After all, is what districts and counties do to each other all the time. And so they shouldn't think that somehow it's just there to spend on local frivolities. It's to spend on things that are really important to local people. And not everything that is really important to local people is just contained within the neighbourhood. So we want to empower them, but we do then expect them to take responsibility too.
So, the gentleman at the back, are there any, and then I'm going to ask a terrible question. Any journalists who want to ask questions? Sean.
Yes, Robert Colville from The Telegraph. You seem to be saying that you're going to rely on councils and local plans to get the extra houses we need. What does that mean for larger schemes such as garden cities? I mean, have they gone the way of eco-towns, or is that still on the back burner?
And the gentleman just in front of him.
Nick, Richard, trustee of Policy Exchange. Bureaucracy is also a huge problem, as well as policies in the planning system. Nearly 2 years ago now, in March 2011, George Osborne announced that there'd be lots of reforms to do with speeding up things like appeals, with simplifying use classes, which bedevil the reuse of empty buildings and the redevelopment of brownfield land. We still haven't seen any action, really, on any of this 2 years on. Can you tell us when we might see something actually happen?
And then let's just take Sean.
And...
No?
Thank you. I was going to call you Minister, but I'll call you Nick. Sean Spears, CPRE. And I would say we all agree, I think, that we need lots more houses, we need better designed houses. The question is where to build them and how to build them. And so 2 points, Nick, if I may. One is we'll need to build on greenfield land if we're going to meet our housing need. That's clear, and CPRE's never called for 100% brownfield targets. But I don't know why you would ease up the pressure on builders and local authorities to build on the plentiful brownfield land that is available now and is not being built out. Because what's actually happening now is that local authorities are being pressured to release inappropriate greenfield land because house builders are saying that the brownfield land that's allocated in local plans is not viable. And so we're going to get back to the position before John Gummer, where more than half of buildings that were built on in the countryside, rather than the situation we've got to since John Gummer introduced the brownfield first policy. So that's one question. The second is, you talk about Germany and Holland and say that if we release more land, more houses will get built and prices will fall. But you might also talk about Spain and Ireland, where there was very weak planning, plentiful land, and actually house prices rose. And this has partly to do with the culture. You know, Britain's desire, the desire of the British people for home ownership is not just about owning a home. It's also about a home as an investment. And that's been endemic across British governments since the war. And it's very, very difficult to tackle. And I wonder if you really think, in your heart of hearts, off the record, in this small gathering, whether if more land was released, the house builders would build more, many more houses, 300,000 houses. They never have since the war. And B, whether you would be happy explaining to David Cameron and George Osborne that you're going to go into a general election on a manifesto of falling house prices.
Very nice question. So I think it's a good place to end.
Yeah.
Sure. Right. So starting with the question about garden cities and major developments. I mean, I think there are two questions in a sense about garden cities. The principles that underlay them as new communities, as new settlements, are fantastic. They are completely contemporary, totally relevant to our age, and anybody who's thinking of doing a major site should look at them very closely, and as they did in Newhall in Harlow, that I keep on banging on about, try and replicate them, but in a modern way. The question is, who should decide where they're going to put a new garden city? And the bit that we are not comfortable with as a government is doing what they did with the new towns, which is where somebody like me sits with a map, and I love maps, as Chris knows, but sits there and sort of does this, and boing, that's where it's going to go. Because that really is not localist by any stretch of the imagination. Now, the good news is that just recently, Tony Baldry, one of my colleagues, made a speech about the future of Bicester, saying, as the local MP, representing local people, that he wanted Bicester to become a garden city. He wanted a major new development on the edge of Bicester to be built according to garden city principles. So it's people coming forward with proposals for major new developments that then might be able to take advantage of the garden city principles, but also maybe to be able to take advantage of some of the legislation that enables local authorities to capture the planning game so they don't have to pay the full development land prices. That we're very much up for, but it does have to come from local authorities first. What was the
Richard's point about Brown?
Richard, sorry,
change of use, which is sort of been stalled.
Richard, it's a very fair chide to us. It's taken too long to do this stuff. A lot of it's going through the Growth and Infrastructure Bill that is now in the Lords, had its second reading in the Lords on Tuesday, I think. There's quite a lot of stuff in the Penfold Review about information requests, restoring the fact that they have to be reasonable, that if a local authority doesn't validate your application because of an unfair thing, you can actually appeal against that. So there's quite a lot of the simplification stuff in that. We've also got a clause creating the ability to bring in a prior approval regime, which is necessary in order to be able to unlock a lot of the use class liberalisation that we want. Because some of the use class liberalisation that we want will nevertheless require you to look narrowly at the issue, for instance, of transport. And so by creating a prior approval regime that is very tightly defined, you can then get rid of the planning permission regime, which is much more, loose and complicated. So I'm hopeful that, within the next couple of months, you'll begin to see the actual way we're going to do some of those relaxations that you're doing. And this is just the first wave. My officials are very much on notice that we're going to be sitting down soon to do the next big wave of use class liberalisations. But the first wave, we've got to just work out exactly how to make them stick. But keep pressure on us, because it has taken too long, and it's a very reasonable criticism. Finally, Sean, firstly, I welcome the fact that you said, of course, we're going to have to build houses on greenfield land. I'm not sure whether we've heard that from the director of the CPRE before, but I'm delighted that we have. I don't think it's right to say that we're reducing pressure on local authorities to look at brownfield sites. And the NPPF is clear on this. And the truth is, even if we weren't clear on it, and we are, God knows local people are. I mean, remember, local authorities, broadly speaking, do what the people who elect them want them to do. And there's no shortage of pressure, let me promise you, on local authorities to build on brownfield sites. And as I say, 76% of last year's house building target was on brownfield sites, up from 50-some in 1997. So there is no quarrel with the preference for brownfield sites, but you've got to accept that some brownfield sites, either in the wrong place, they're in parts of the country where frankly the need for new housing isn't as great as it is elsewhere, or they're incredibly expensive to develop. And there economics does have to come into this somewhere. If you've got to invest an enormous amount in infrastructure, then that's just going to make it much harder to build enough houses that we need. So I think that there has to be a balance. All I'm saying is that empty homes play their part, brownfield play a very, very important part. I don't want to pretend that I'm not keen to get the big builders to use the planning permissions they've got. Of course I'm keen, but let's not think that there are any silver bullets out there that let us off the hook. We are on a hook, we have a growing population, we have a desperate need, we are inflicting misery on a generation of people who are working hard, paying taxes, and have the right to expect what me, age 46, got, which is a place that I could afford to buy in my late 20s. They have that right, it's a moral right, and I'm not going to stop until we deliver it.
I can see Matt wants to say something very briefly, so I'm going to let him just have a few words and then I'll wrap up and let the Minister go on because I'm sure he's very busy.
Yeah, just to justify my seat here a little. I think it's important to recognise the consequences of the Brownfield First policy, and they're real and they're problematic. I grew up in a village, I now have to live in an apartment in a city. I have a small daughter. All the contemporaries in my NCT group are living in small flats that they don't want to live in. They want gardens, they can't trade up. It has consequences. It also has consequences in rural areas. The person who sleeps on their workshop floor is living in a village. He's a very talented carpenter. He could build his own house if he was given the land to do so. But unfortunately, we prioritise cramming more and more housing into places that people don't necessarily particularly want to live. And I think it's right that we rethink that.
Okay, I'll wrap on that. I'll just remind you to ask the interns in your office how they feel about housing policy when you're writing about this topic. But I'd like to say thank you to Nick for such an interesting speech, and thank you all for coming. And I hope we can do something like this again at Policy Exchange soon.
Good stuff. Thank you.